Today I want to talk about something, though, that is serious. Today I want to talk about a war that the mainstream media is ignoring. From Boston to Zanzibar, there's a worldwide war on Christianity. Christians are being attacked around the world, but you won't hear much about it on the evening news because the answer's not convenient. It doesn't fit the narrative we have been told about radical Islam. The president tries to gloss over who's attacking and killing Christians. The media describes the killings as sectarian. But the truth is, a worldwide war on Christians is being waged by a fanatical element of Islam. Ever since 9/11, commentators have tried to avoid pointing fingers at Islam, which is somewhat fair. It is fair to point out that most Muslims are not committed to violence against Christians, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is, and we shouldn't let political correctness stand in the way of this truth, the whole truth is that there is a minority of Muslims who condone killing of Christians, but unfortunately, that minority numbers in the tens of millions. Pew Research did a poll, and it indicated that 21% of Egyptians, 15% of Jordanians, many Jordanians are our friend, but 15%, 13% of Pakistani Muslims find terrorism acceptable, if not laudable. It's a minority to be sure, but if you add up the numbers in just 3 countries, it's over 40 million Muslims sympathize with violence against Christians. This shouldn't be understated. A Daily Telegraph survey indicated that there were 100,000 Muslims in Britain who fully supported the London subway bombings. 400,000 said they had some sympathy for these bombings. This is not a little problem, and it's not going away quickly. In Syria, there's an ancient Christian city called Maaloula, where they still speak Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke. They've been Christians since the time of Christ. They're a small final outpost in the Middle East for Christians. The town was recently overrun by Islamic rebels. These Islamic rebels swarmed into the town and they demanded that everyone convert to Islam or die. Sarkis el-Zakam stood up and he answered them. And he said, "I am a Christian, and if you want to kill me because I am, do so." These were Sarkis' last words. Sister Carmel of Damascus said of Sarkis, "His death is true martyrdom, a death in odium fidei, or a death in the hatred of faith." Make no mistake, this is about your religion. Elsewhere in Syria, Islamic rebels have filmed beheadings of their captives. They've filmed themselves eating the heart of their enemy. 2 Christian bishops have been kidnapped and 1 priest was recently killed. These rebels are allies of the Islamic rebels that President Obama is now arming. We are now arming Islamic rebels who are allied with Al-Qaeda that attacked us on 9/11. Does that make any sense at all? American tax dollars should never be spent to prop up a war on Christianity, but that's what's happening now across the globe. As Christians, we should take a stand and fight against any of your tax dollars funding any persecution of Christians. In Zanzibar, a tiny little island off the coast of Africa, a priest was recently shot in the head on his way to church by 2 Muslim youths. A message by the Muslim Renewal said, "We thank our young men trained in Somalia for killing the infidel. Many more will die. We will burn homes and churches. We have not finished. At Easter, be prepared for disaster." In Kenya, motorcycle assailants hurled bombs into a Christian church, injuring 15 people and breaking the legs of the pastor. In Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim nation, 3 girls were beheaded on the way to their Christian school. Make no mistake, there is an element of radical jihad in this. In Guinea this year, a Muslim mob attacked and killed 95 Christians and injured 130. In Egypt, just recently, 82 churches were attacked, leaving hundreds dead and wounded. Earlier this year, I forced the Senate to vote to defund the Muslim Brotherhood, and every Democrat voted to continue sending your money to the Muslim Brotherhood. I can tell you one thing, though. As long as I'm in the Senate, I will fight against sending any money to the Muslim Brotherhood. In Cameroon recently, 2 Christians who had converted from Islam were murdered. In Iran, American pastor Saeed Abedini is detained indefinitely, facing physical and psychological torture. They asked him to renounce his faith, the same thing they asked Sarkis el-Zakhem before he was killed. I've introduced a resolution into the Senate that says, and calls for, and says we should do everything within our power, within our voice, from the White House, from the State Department, from our government, to release Saeed Abedini. And I will not rest until Pastor Abedini is freed. Across the globe, Christians are under attack, almost as if we lived in the Middle Ages or as if we lived under early pagan Roman rule. You remember the early Christian martyrs, our disciples, the disciples of Christ. It's almost as if that is happening again throughout the Middle East. This administration does nothing to stop it, and it can be argued that they are giving aid and comfort to those who tolerate these crimes. In Libya, the country we freed from oppression, the militias that apparently were guarding our ambassador have raided a Christian church, rounding up hundreds of Christians, accusing them of being missionaries, accusing them of having the crime of having a cross or a Bible. Many were tortured, and one Christian was recently killed by these same militias. In Pakistan last week, 75 Christians were killed, several hundred more killed in a bombing of a church. Asia Bibi is a Pakistani Christian. She sits on death row for blasphemy. She says it all began when she drew water from a Muslim well. As she was filling her bowl of water, a crowd formed and chanted, "Death, death to the Christian." She pleaded for her life. She was pelted with stones, punched in the face, and dragged through the streets. The local imam finally interceded to say, "If you don't want to die, you must convert to Islam." The crowd descended on her, beating her with sticks. Finally, the police stopped the attackers, only to arrest her. She has now been on death row for the crime of blasphemy. What I say is, until Asia Bibi is freed, not $1 of U.S. aid should go to Pakistan. Many of you have heard of Malayla, the precocious 14-year-old who was shot in the head by the Taliban for the crime of wishing that girls could go to school. She's not a Christian, but even so, the radical Islamists cannot tolerate to hear this 14-year-old girl who seeks nothing more than an education, nothing more than the right to go to school. If you haven't listened to her, pull up one of her YouTubes and listen to her. She's amazing, this young woman, her poise, her elegance. But what a bizarre distortion of religion. Someone who would shoot a little girl in the head to make a religious point? I ask, where's the rest of Islam? Why don't they stand up and condemn this? The Urdu poet Praveen Shakir wrote, "They insist on examining the firefly in the daylight. The children of our age have grown clever." Radical Islam will end only when Islam begins to police itself. Only when Islam allows her children, like Malayla, to examine the firefly in the daylight. Only then will knowledge, enlightenment, then will begin to glow and grow, and violence, religious violence, will recede. We should all pray for that day to come sooner rather than later. We send billions of dollars to Egypt, to Pakistan. We've helped put new Islamic regimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. President Obama now sends arms to Islamic rebels in Syria. In Egypt, the mob attacked our embassy, climbed on top of our embassy, and burned our flag. I don't know about you, but I've had enough. I say not one penny more to any country that would burn the American flag. We must work to ensure that our country, our policies, our tax dollars are on the side of ending this violence rather than encouraging those who perpetrate it. This war on Christianity is not just abroad. It came to Boston this year, just in time for the marathon. 2 Islamic radicals blew up dozens of civilians. I guess they thought somehow killing women and children would make a religious or a political point. Now, you might argue, say, well, maybe they weren't targeting Christians, but they certainly didn't target a mosque. Their motive, if you can perceive one, was not against our government, but against us as a people, a Christian people. How someone could believe that killing innocent people could further one's cause is beyond me. Shortly after the attack, I met one of the Boston policemen who was there, one of the first responders. He described his feelings, the horror as he witnessed this war zone, his sadness as he raced to apply tourniquets and try to stop bleeding, and just the death and carnage, what he saw as he showed up. He described his anger as he pursued these 2 Islamic radicals through the streets. He described that he felt it was justified. There was a shootout, one of them was killed. And if you're going to kill innocents, you will receive the same. But he also said that after we captured the last one, after we captured and disarmed the last bomber, he said he also described a special appreciation for American justice. After the younger bomber was apprehended, he said, we didn't drag him through the streets and beat him to death with tire irons. He will get a lawyer. He will get a trial. It's what makes us different from them. When I talk to our young soldiers, my wife and I have helped build a home for a young soldier who lost 3 limbs in one of our neighboring towns in Kentucky. When I talk to them and I ask them, what were you fighting for? What did you fight for? What did it mean to fight for your country? And they said that the essence of what we fought for was our freedom, our Bill of Rights, our Constitution. We have to believe and preserve those. That's what we're here for. That's what we're here to fight for. That's what our young men and women have put their lives on the line for. Now, some politicians say that this war on Christianity means that we must fight a large conventional war against all of radical Islam. Well, part of my point here is to tell you there's 50 million, 100 million. This isn't going to be fought with a conventional war. It's going to require Islam to police Islam. But there will be times, and we will have to defend ourselves. We were right to go to war after 9/11. There are times when military action is justified and necessary. I believe we must be willing and able to defend ourselves against the jihadist. But we must also re-examine our policies, because military action can at times actually enable and empower radical Islam. I think going into Syria could possibly enable Al-Qaeda. It could make things worse. So we have to be very clear about that. In Egypt, in Libya, and Syria, it's still unclear whether the war, the changes, or the new regimes are going to be more friendly or less friendly to America. To me, it doesn't make any sense to send American arms, American planes, or American troops to aid Syrian rebels or the Muslim Brotherhood, for goodness sakes. We should stop it. In the future, I see less and less conventional wars. I don't see the possibility of how 50 to 100 million radical jihadists are defeated, but they have to be contained and we have to defend ourselves. Make no mistake, we should actively defend ourselves. But the ultimate answer, I really think, comes that the rest of Islam that is not radical has to police radical Islam. The Islamic republics, they see us as invaders and infidels. They're never going to accept us through force of arms. Somehow, though, they must be made to understand that they must root out and destroy the sadists and killers amongst them, the ones who distort and contort religion to justify killing of civilians and children. Islam needs to remember and recreate the good in their history. For centuries, the Middle East was home to cultural and intellectual centers of ancient world. Math and science flourished in the Middle Ages. Tolerance and sophistication were the norm at one time in the Middle East. The great medieval physician Rhazes identified smallpox and measles. The great Persian mathematician Al-Khwarizmi made advances in algebra. There was enlightenment at one time in that part of the world. Islam carried the light of learning for centuries. They paved the way for our enlightenment. This history needs to be brought back to life again. Innovation in Muslim communities developed the magnetic compass, pens, and printing. It was said at one time that books were printed in Cairo, passed out in Baghdad. I mean, the world really, at one point in time in the Middle East, was something that was very amazing. It needs to come back, but they need to figure this out. And the policing has to come from them. As late as the 1960s, it was said that books were printed in Cairo, read in Baghdad. There was a time in our history when Islam was policing itself. Most Muslims describe Islam as a peaceful and tolerant religion. At one time, they prized inquiry over the heads of infidels, the scientific method over fanaticism. I believe Islam still contains some of the roots of this classical traditions and can return to them. In the meantime, we must defend ourselves. Make no mistake about it. We need to understand that the war on Christianity is not being waged by a rare anomaly, but by a significant minority that numbers in the millions. Christians should be prepared for war, but actively seek peace. Reagan said we should strive for peace through strength, and I agree. I urge us not to lose sight of either. Too often, we've lost sight of peace as the goal. The message of the Gospels is not war. Hopefully, the message of Christianity, if listened to, can be part of an eventual peace process. In the meantime, take action. Pray for a solution. Hold your politicians accountable for standing up and protecting life and standing up against the war on Christianity. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Dancing and singing.